Okay, I've got 11 o'clock on my schedule here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to PROergonomics webinar on cognitive demands in the workplace. This has been an incredibly hot topic. We've had an overwhelming response of attendees today, so chances are good that we're going to have quite a few questions coming in because we've never had this many people attend a webinar. So if you do have questions, just some housekeeping things, or want to provide any feedback or answer any questions that I give you, you're just going to type it into the chat box there on the left-hand side of your screen. I know folks were already doing that when they were giving me feedback about the sound, which is great. If you do have questions, please share. I do have one of my partners online with me today. So Sarah Snable is here, and she is running the chat room section. So she will try and field any questions and alert me to the fact that they are there. So hopefully I can address them as we're going along. But we will also take time for questions at the end. So if I don't get it in the moment, I will try and go back and revisit it then, or you can resend it at the end when we do open it up to general questions. But I absolutely encourage your questions as we go along, so please feel free to type them in the chat room, and I will do my best to participate and get those answered as we go. So just a little bit about PROergonomics. We are a consulting company that provides full-service ergonomic assessments. So we do office assessments, industrial work, obviously physical demands assessments, and a lot of what you are here today to talk about or learn more about is the idea of a cognitive demands assessment as well. So we're going to focus on all of those things and trying to address how we do that, what the process is, how would you go about using that information, or maybe conducting them yourselves, certainly using that information as part of the accommodation process, because we know that this is a hot topic. There are a lot of folks that are, we're getting better at assessing our assessing our physical demands of a job, but we still have a lot to learn about how we accommodate the cognitive demands and how we bring someone back to work who has cognitive limitations. So we are going to try and address all of those things today. In the brief time that we have. So the plan for the day is what are our cognitive demands. Let's get on the same page to start. Then we're going to talk about the cognitive issues at the workplace. So how do the cognitive requirements of a job impact our ability to be successful? And then we're going to spend some time, And then we're going to spend some time talking about behavioral demands, which is really where we use the cognitive elements and actually put them into play in our daily routine. And then we're going to spend our last bit, and probably one of the most important parts, is talking about, for you guys, how do you actually use this information and achieve a successful return to work? Because this is not easy. I won't pretend that it's easy, and that's probably a message you'll hear throughout today. It's a very unique process, person to person, which is a little bit different than the physical demands. With physical, we've been able to be more structured and more proactive about it. And unfortunately with cognitive demands, because it is so unique, in many cases it has to be individualized and therefore reactive. So this isn't an easy process. We'll give you some suggestions and ideas on how we can achieve that and what kinds of things we should be looking for. So starting with the idea of what are cognitive demands, really cognition really refers to the idea of understanding. And so the important part here is that we're able to gather, use, and process information appropriately. So obviously this comes into play in every element of work, right? We are always using information that's at our disposal in a certain way. Even someone who does something incredibly cyclical, so they work on an assembly line and they let's say the cycle time is 10 seconds or even 5 seconds, that very cyclical work in theory has less cognitive demands because you do the same thing over and over. So there's less memory, there's other elements that aren't present because of the high cyclical demand. But even within a cycle, you have things that you do first, second, and third. You may not have 15 things, but you still have those few things that you need to do in order. You may need to feel something or ensure that it gets attached correctly and realize that that means that you can move on to the next step. And if you aren't able to take in all that information and process it properly, then that understanding piece, there's a gap there, right? We're not able to successfully complete all the tasks, or perhaps maybe not 100% of the time because we're not catching all of those other cues. So really a person's ability to acquire knowledge is based on several things, right? If we're talking about a workplace example where you have to engage with other people, we use this information that's listed there to create that understanding. So we use social cues, we use body language, and we use verbal communication, right? Let's think about body language first. So in terms of body language, if someone is not interested in what you're saying, right? I teach a class at the college part-time, so there are times that I would say my students are not really that interested. They've tuned out. They're thinking about something else. I've gotten boring, or the topic has gotten boring for them, right? And they give me all kinds of body language, right? Those students are now texting, right? I was teaching this morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. Some of them look like they're dozing off, right? They're having a hard time. This is not a reflection of my teaching skills, by the way, but some of them look like they're dozing off and they're having a hard time staying awake, right? They maybe aren't making eye contact. They're focusing on their computer or their phone. All of those things send me a message that they're no longer hearing me. They're not interested. On the flip side of that, sometimes they're very interested, but they don't understand. And I can get that from a visual thing as well, right? Their body language may tell me that they don't understand what I'm talking about, and then I need to go back and revisit it. Someone with a cognitive limitation may not be able to take in the body language information and actually use it to make an evaluation, right? That is a skill, to be able to take in those visual cues, like someone on their phone or on their computer, or someone making a face that says I don't understand, or whispering to their neighbor. All of those things are telling me they don't get it, and I may not be able to actually take it from those visual cues and turn it into a comprehension, like they don't understand, therefore I need to re-explain it, right? Not everybody can do that. And then there's also social cues. You think about a time that you have a conversation with someone, they tell you through visual things as well as through a normal pattern or routine of a conversation when it's appropriate for you to jump in, right? If you're talking to someone, they pause at the right moments, waiting for you to respond, because that's how a conversation works. But someone with a cognitive limitation may not understand those basic social cues that tell them when to participate in that conversation. So they may be limited by that. And then obviously verbal communication is huge. What they take in verbally and what they use can be a huge challenge. Do they hear those the instructions that you're giving them? Did they process or use those instructions and actually understand them in a way that they can execute them? And that can be a huge challenge, especially when we work in environments where there's highly customized language, right? So I go into some workplaces and I'm constantly asking for somebody to interpret something. I do not understand what you are saying because you are using language that's internally it is only relevant or makes sense internally. Somebody with a cognitive limitation may have a really hard time picking up that lingo, and then may have an even harder time translating that into actual practice or into actual using that information. So cognitive limitations or issues occur due to various injuries, accidents, incidents. I mean, there's a million reasons why somebody has a cognitive issue. It might be something that is internal. So it might be something that they've had for their entire life. They have a learning disability, for example, and they need to learn in a different way. That's something that they may have been born with, right? They may have carried that through for a long time. But sometimes there may have been an accident, whether it be at the workplace or maybe a motor vehicle accident, or it may have been an incident, which is what the case study that I'm going to talk to you about later, the case study I've made up there, is about an incident with a lockdown procedure at a school, and then how our secretary responds to that, right? That's an incident. It occurred at work. It could occur in a personal environment as well, but those may create cognitive limitations, and then obviously that can roll over and impact work if it didn't originally happen there. So I've given you some examples. By no means is that an exhaustive list, but it is interesting to note that some of those are things you would be born with, and some of those are things that you might actually acquire over time. What I thought was perhaps the most interesting when I was doing, or one of the most interesting pieces, I should say, when I was doing some research for this presentation is that the idea that symptoms of mental health disorders can be incredibly different at work than when you are in other situations. So somebody who copes really well when they are at home, for example, right, in their home, their natural environment with their family, where everything is structured and set up to accommodate them and to work with their needs, then they can be incredibly successful there. But sometimes you take them and put them into a work environment and they have an entirely different set of limitations. So sometimes the work environment does create, or in some cases maybe even eliminate, some of the issues that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So it's not just enough to look at what they're challenged by on a day-to-day basis. You need to actually evaluate what it's like when they're at work, because an employee who's had, let's say, an acquired cognitive limitation, over time they may not be able, if they've gotten it and they haven't been back to work since, they may be able to tell you what's happening at home and how they're accommodating themselves at home. But when they get to work, they may have completely different symptoms or issues that they don't have at home, which are going to need to be accommodated. So you need to just keep that in mind. We need to use what they're doing at home, perhaps, or in their personal life, if that's what they are able to share with you as accommodations. But then we need to also readdress it when they're at work. Yes, we set up some cognitive accommodations, but are they actually working? Because the work environment is incredibly different than the other environments they're exposed to. I wanted to touch base with this because this was another interesting thing that came out of another article I was doing as part of my research, is the financial impact of cognitive demands on the workplace. We know that there's a significant number of musculoskeletal disorders in our Ontario workplaces, so the physical element is huge, but we aren't fabulous yet at really documenting and evaluating or evaluating or quantifying really the mental health related issues and the financial impact of that. In the workplace, a research study found that the most costly health conditions were, and these are in order, depression, obesity, arthritis, back and neck pain, and anxiety. And you can see that I've bolded 4 of those. And I think all 4 of them could be connected to cognitive limitations, right? We know depression is obviously directly related to mental health. Arthritis and back and neck pain can be connected to chronic pain. If they have that as an issue, then that certainly can be connected to the cognitive limitations and what they believe they're able to do, what their perception of pain is. And then obviously anxiety is a huge factor as well, because the workplace asks you to perform and asks you to perform at your top ability in most cases. So it's incredibly important that we are focusing on mental health in the workplace and focusing on cognitive limitations associated with that, so that we can reduce the financial impact. So not only is it good just for our employees to keep them healthier and safer, but it has an impact on a company's bottom line, which is important as well. So that goes on to that study went on to describe a little bit more about what that looks like. And in particular, it focused on indirect costs. So we know that direct costs are things like employees' wages and perhaps lost time. We might even be able to quantify some other elements of that. But we're not always very good still at quantifying our indirect costs. And in particular, when we're talking about cognitive limitations, this is most relevant for lost productivity. So if we lose productivity, it might be we lose productivity because an employee is struggling to keep up. We might be that they are having a difficult time understanding the process. They may be asking way more questions. They may need other help that we haven't provided yet. So if we can focus on how to accommodate them most effectively, we should be able to improve or increase their cost effectiveness and reduce the financial impact of this. Unfortunately, a lot of folks who have mental health disorders don't get a lot of treatment, or maybe they get some treatment, but it's not the full treatment that they need. So companies really need to spend money on mental health, ideally to help their staff, but also as a result improving their bottom line. So we have a great opportunity here to benefit these employees and benefit our bottom line by figuring out how to accommodate and manage some of these mental health issues at work, or cognitive limitations at work. So I want to talk more about this idea, or this concept of cognitive demands at work, and what this looks like, and how we document it, and what different pieces are required. So let's talk about first the idea of cognitive resources and cognitive skills. So cognitive resources are the kinds of things that we need in order to be able to take in information. So, if somebody is giving you instructions, for example, detailed instructions about how to work through a software program, so let's say you're somebody who orders product for a kitchen or for a hospital or something, right? They order product of some kind. You need to have some basic cognitive resources to be able to take in those steps. How do I log into the program? How do I open an order form? How do I process an order? What are the steps that are required? So that's going to, to take in that information, I'm going to require some memory, because likely I'm not going to have a step-by-step instruction sheet every single time. And in fact, if somebody gives me verbal instructions first, I have to remember those the next time that I go back. Attention, to pay attention to the person who's delivering the information. Maybe communication, so that I can ask questions. Obviously, there's auditory processing. There might even be visual if it's one-on-one time that they're getting. And then obviously computer skills. So those are just some examples of what cognitive resources might be that people need in order to be able to literally take in the information. A cognitive skill is like the next level, right? So the cognitive resource is the foundation. I need to have these things in place to take in the information. A cognitive skill is the next level. Basically a cognitive skill is that being able to use the information. So cognitive resource, take it in, cognitive skill, be able to use it. So now that I understand how this process works, this ordering process and information works, then maybe I need to be addressing the critical thinking. I need to be able to take that information in and problem solve. So let's say I'm placing an order and something abnormal happens, right? Something that hasn't happened before. Maybe it's custom to the person I'm ordering from. Maybe I've made a mistake along the way and I need to figure out how to fix it so that I can continue along with the order. I need to be able to use my cognitive resources and my knowledge and my memory about how the program works in order to process through that, right? So all of these things work hand in hand. I need to first have the resources, and then I need to have the skills in order to use the resources and actually execute the tasks. The next level of this is the idea of behavioral demands. So now that I have the resources and the skills that I need, all of this translates to how I behave at work, which is another whole level, right? And perhaps from an employer's perspective, one of the most important levels. I can often help people take in information in different ways depending on how I present it. We're going to visit that a little bit later. And I might even be able to help them process through some of that information. So for example, the critical thinking piece. What happens if there's an error? Here are some troubleshooting guides. That's trying to eliminate some of the critical thinking, right? And we see troubleshooting guides in all kinds of different aspects of life. You're building a bookshelf at home, there may be a troubleshooting guide. You're installing a program on your computer, there may be a troubleshooting guide. It's trying to help you with the critical thinking piece. So that we might be able to even help with all of those aspects. But we also need to be able to have people be able to use those skills and those resources to create, to participate in the behavioral element of work. So I've got 4 different categories here I want to address. The first one is enactment of social processes, interactions, and relationships. Now, if you work on an assembly line and you don't ever have to speak to anybody else, save maybe your supervisor or a manager of some kind, then perhaps this one is less relevant at your workplace. But in many cases, we need to be able to discuss or have conversations and participate in regular social processes with, if you're thinking about a hospitality industry, with guests that are visiting a hotel, right? Or working at a front desk. Maybe your receptionist, for example, is going to need these skills at any office or facility. You likely need to interact with other people and have meaningful conversations where they take in information that you're sharing, you take information that they are, right? How does that look like? How do I actually use those skills and those resources and make this happen? Then we also need to be able to manage conflict. Again, not present in every job, but in a lot of jobs, conflict or issues with staff or guests or other purchasers, perhaps. If you have like a customer coming in to actually purchase something, we have to be able to manage conflicts or issues. An order got placed wrong, right? Even over the phone sometimes, and that's another whole kettle of fish. You have in-person conversations versus on the phone. I'm sure you have had a conversation with someone in person and then got that exact same person on the phone and totally wondering what the difference is, right? They are completely different on the phone than they are in person. Some people are good at phone conversations. Some people are terrible at phone conversations, right? And that's going to be hard for someone who has a cognitive limitation. They may be better in person than they are on the phone, or they may be better on the phone when they aren't and not in person because there's a less personal connection that way. And so we just need to be thoughtful of that as well. How do they manage conflict? How do they deal with people in whatever situation they need to address them in? Obviously, we also need to be able to interpret nonverbal cues and gestures. So the environment might be busy. There might be lots of distractions. We need to be able to actually interpret nonverbal cues and take that information in as well. So those are some examples of the behavioral demands at work. Another example might be the enactment of responsibilities and requirements. We have expectations of our employees, and maybe from the very base element of a job, I need them to be able to complete those very basic elements. I need to be able to trust them really to do the basic worker responsibilities. They need to be able to receive supervision. If they aren't completely individually able to work on their own, they need to be able to receive supervision from someone, which includes understanding instructions, processing that information, and executing those instructions. They may need to work independently. They might also need to work interdependently, right? That might be an element. They work with several people in a group, and the more complex that work unit is, the harder this might be for some folks, right? I can work interdependently in that I prepare a document for the next person down the line and then maybe have to give them feedback or instructions about what I've included in that. But if 4 people have to sit down in a think tank and come up with a problem solving or a solution for a problem that the company is having, that's another whole way of working interdependently. So some people may be able to do one, but not the other. And so we need to be able to evaluate that in some way. We also need to be able to take initiative. So there are lots of times that I want an employee to be able to take steps or take an initiative on their own and make a decision, right? As a supervisor, I can't be there every day answering every single question. In some environments that might be realistic, and many employees are given some leeway to make decisions on their own and do things on their own. And that is another thing that not everyone is capable of doing. And then obviously exercise control over their workplace, their work pace. If I need if it's a manufacturing facility, I need them to complete 1,000 pieces in a day, and they can work sort of at their own speed. There isn't an assembly line driving the process. I need them to be able to maintain that speed and meet those numbers. Or if they're in accounting and I need them to complete payroll by the end of the day, then they have to be able to, sort of work at their own pace and achieve those goals. There's also a lot of emotional job demands that go along with the workplace, right? It's basically anytime you have to interact with someone or you take real pride and ownership over something. Maybe you don't even interact with people, but you really are proud of the ownership of what you do. You may have a real emotional attachment to your job and the end product, perhaps even. So that can be a challenge. We need to be able to demonstrate self-confidence in the workplace and regulating emotions, right? There are times that people feel emotional. There are times that people will be particularly proud or excited about something they've completed. There'll be particular times where things haven't gone very well. They've had a bad day. Maybe they were, creating something new or trying to develop a new process or idea and it hasn't worked out. And we need to be able to regulate those emotions, and that can be difficult for some folks with cognitive limitations. Obviously, a positive attitude is always a plus. It's not always essential. Someone with a negative attitude can sometimes be successful at work, but a lot of times if you have to work with other people, then the positive attitude is key in order to see success. And anytime you have to engage with others, sensitivity is a huge factor. And this maybe is even more amplified over the last several years with the idea of workplace harassment and things, right? We need to make sure that people are able to be sensitive to other folks in the environment. And if you aren't reading social cues to realize that someone's getting upset, how do you be sensitive to that person? Because you truly don't even recognize that they are getting upset by the conversation that you're having with them or by the situations that they're being presented with. And if you can't take that information in, then it's going to be difficult to exercise sensitivity. And the last one I want to highlight, there are a couple others, but I thought these were the most relevant to the wide variety of industries. So we also need to enact general competencies and accountabilities. You have to be able to pay attention to details. I don't think any job that you work at, there's truly no detail orientation required, right? You have to be able to pay attention to details and execute. Like a cleaner is looking at how clean their space is, that they've gotten all the touch points, that they have cleaned every different piece that they were supposed to clean. An assembly person is going to be obviously making sure all the bits and pieces went in the right order and met the standards. And then somebody working in HR or in a role that has more social elements to it needs to pay attention to even more details in terms of the processes and procedures and how people are feeling and responding to situations. Although we truly don't multitask, we certainly need to be able to perform multiple tasks. Like, I mean, there's lots of research out there to say that we only truly do one task at a time, but we often have 5 things on the go. So we flip from one thing to the other. And I often joke that many of you online today actually probably wear many hats at your workplace, right? You might be the HR person and the health and safety person and the person who's responding to accommodation needs and, right? And so the interesting part about this is that how do we actually perform those multiple tasks? How do we bounce from one thing to the other? It's really hard to, and you will know this already, it's really hard to switch hats all the time, right? It's really a difficult thing. So it's going to be a challenge for some folks to be able to do that. And then managing their own schedule and routine. If they have a structure or a plan for the day, then we need to be able to accomplish that in the plan that's listed out there for them. I got a question coming in that says, wondering when the Ministry of Labor will enact legislation and they can use Section 25H reasonably. And I think at this point, we don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did. I wish I could give you some numbers or some dates and times as to when this will happen. I mean, I think the changes to the accommodation has certainly drawn attention to this focus, which is why we have 75 people online today, right? Learning about cognitive demands of a job and how do we accommodate those. So we're already seeing increased focus. Do we have a date or a timeline as to when this is actually going to occur and be consistently enforced? No, I don't think we do, and I wish I could answer that question in a better way for you. The CSA does have some does have a psychological demands guideline, which you can use to help with the process, but again, it's not as, there's still a lot of ambiguity to the process and how it all works. Okay, so let's talk about all of this in context of return to work, because I know this is why many of you are on today is revisiting this and how do we actually get these folks back to work successfully. So the achieving a successful return to work of an employee with cognitive limitations, as I already said, is not easy, right? It is not simple, and I believe that customized accommodation solutions are really the best solution in order to make this work. You are going to, everybody, even if they, let's say, I've actually had several conversations about concussions just lately, right? You've had an employee who's had a concussion at work or, you know, maybe playing a sport in the evening or whatever, right? But they're coming back to work and they've had a concussion, and every employee responds differently to a concussion, right? Some employees are back within a couple weeks. Some of them are back within a couple months. Some of them come back with virtually no limitations. Others have quite a few, right? This is where return to work becomes really challenging. When we think about physical accommodations, right? When you think about soft tissue injury, you know that the employee with the right treatment and the right return to work process, 6 to 8 weeks is a pretty common timeline that you see for some significant recovery to happen. Maybe not 100%, but significant recovery. The same cannot be said for cognitive limitations. Everybody responds really differently to these, which is why we customize or need to customize our accommodations as best as possible. That doesn't mean we can't do some prepping ahead and have some plans in place on how we deal with folks who have issues with reading written word or taking in verbal communication, right? We can have some common strategies for that, but which pieces we pull out of our toolbox for which situations are always going to be unique, right? You're going to pull out pieces A, B, and C for one person and A, B, and Z for another because they are different. Okay, awesome. Documenting cognitive demands has really, in my opinion, is really the first step in this process that over the years we've gotten pretty good at documenting the physical demands. A lot of companies we work with have physical demands assessments, and they know that they are documenting what is required physically, and when they have a return to work case, they're comparing the employee's limitations to what the job requires from a physical perspective. So we are getting better at documenting and using our physical demands assessments. Now, what we're not doing great at yet, and what a lot of folks, we're having actually a lot of requests for over the last couple months, is really this idea of documenting cognitive demands, right? It is challenging to objectively document the cognitive demands of a job, but I think it's important to achieving overall successful accommodation. We need, just as with a physical assessment, we need to know what the cognitive demands of the job are, and so that we can move forwards with trying to find a match. For example, you have an employee who has a limitation with communication, let's say, verbal communication. They have a hard time articulating ideas. They can speak, but they have a hard time articulating ideas and sharing information, certainly sharing it in multiple ways, right? Does your role require that? It might. If they are in a management role, then it certainly would, right? But if they are someone who works in a department, so let's say they work in they work in a production facility, they work in a department, operating a machine of some kind, do they need to be able to communicate information that way? Or if they do need to be able to, can someone else help them in some way? Is there another way to communicate that or share that information? So we're seeing a huge number of requests associated with cognitive demands, and most often they're being paired with physical demands. So what we're being asked to do is to complete a physical demands assessment and then also complete a cognitive demands assessment. So document while we're doing physical, document the cognitive demands as well. So the CDA document most commonly includes the demand. So what is the demand? Is it time management? Is it prioritizing? Is it verbal communication? There are hundreds of things that could go in here, and we often customize this to meet the individual job itself. So there are times when, for example, pattern recognition might be important. Think about police officers. They're going to need to be able to read facial expressions and behavioral things that someone who is working on a production line is never going to need, right? So we would customize the CDA to match the demands that are present. So we'll add or delete or modify things as we need to, right? So that's the first step, is just getting the right demands in there. So if that requires customization, that's step one. And then step two is trying to describe how and when it's required. This is where your cognitive demands assessment needs to become as objective as possible. So how does it occur? When do they need to be able, when does a police officer need to be able to read facial expressions, right? How critical is it? How complex is it to their role? Is it critical? Is it absolutely necessary? What happens? What are the consequences if they can't do it, or if they miss a facial expression, right? What then happens? So this is the kind of information that you want to document, because the complexity or the potential repercussions of missing it are also an element, right? If I miss a facial expression, but it really, like as a salesperson, let's think about it this way. As a salesperson, I want to know when it's appropriate to close the sale. How is the employee or is the customer responding to me? Are they responding well? Are they keen? Are they interested? Do I think they're going to buy the product, right? I will read visual cues for that. I will read their behavioral cues. But if I miss it, I lose a sale, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, that might be important to the company. But if we're talking about selling a pair of shoes that's $50, it is not going to make or break the company's month, year, or even their day, right? But if I'm a police officer and I'm missing a cue that might tell me something about this person's guilt or innocence, or their likely next actions, whether they be violent or otherwise, that could have potential catastrophic effects, right? So I need to understand both when it's required and what elements are required. What is complexity? How complex is it? How essential is it? The other element of this is that you may be able to document the frequency. This is not always easy, and it's not always relevant depending on the job demand, but you might document how frequently, for example, I'll use the police officer example again. How frequently does that individual actually have this occur, right? And it might depend on the type of officer, right? A detective may have something different than a street officer. And so we need to try and document how frequently does this occur, right? This is not always easy to document when you're talking about things like time management, for example, or problem solving and things, because those happen so frequently that it's almost irrelevant to document frequency, besides to say that it's, it happens regularly throughout the day. And so it's just trying to figure out how you objectively document this. Document the complexity, document the frequency, and then actually describe it. And the description can be as important, unlike a physical demands assessment, where the quantities, right, how frequently it occurs, and what percentage of the day they spend doing it and what angle they're at, is actually probably more important in some ways than the actual description that goes along with it, right? In the cognitive demands assessment, we continually find that the description is equally important, that the description gives us a lot of detail that we may need as part of the accommodation process, because it is unique, right? So we need to understand all of that. So at this point, I want to just make a quick note. We are really pumped today to be able to offer something to our webinar attendees. We truly believe that cognitive demands assessments are the wave of the future. I can't tell you how many requests we've had over the last 2 or 3 months that have been asking for PDAs combined with cognitive demands assessments, or even just expanding and giving a more detailed cognitive element in an existing PDA. That we believe that this is definitely the next step in the cognitive accommodation process. So as a result of that, we actually have a special offer for everybody who's attending today. We're going to be giving away some cognitive demands assessments. So if you choose to move forwards with a physical demands assessment with us, we will do the cognitive demands assessment for you for free. So we're actually going to be offering that at the end of the webinar in more detail, just because we think companies need these, and they need them, and they may not even realize they need them yet or how helpful they can be. And we want to help companies see how this will work for them, how they can actually use it. So stay tuned to the end of the webinar. I will be giving you more details about how you take advantage of that offer and what it includes as we get there. So let's talk about accommodations, right? That's the next piece. Once we know what the cognitive demands of a job are, now we need to deal with the accommodations, right? How are we going to actually accommodate this? So I thought, I found these questions in an article I was reading the other day, and I modified a few of them, but I liked the concept, right? That there are questions we need to consider before we do every single accommodation, right? Because it is unique and customized to individual employees, we need to know what limitations the employee experiences. And I also would like to add to that what they experience while they're at work, right? Not just while they're at home, while they're at work, which connects back to the previous conversation. How do these limitations impact their job performance? In some instances, a cognitive limitation may exist, but the employee is virtually not impacted at work at all. And at other times, it's going to completely hinder their ability to do their job. So we need to look at what is the impact on their job performance. And then, are there specific job tasks that are challenging? And you can look at the flip side as well. Are there specific job tasks that are not challenging, that they're very capable of doing in this moment? And that may help you achieve your accommodation strategies. If there are jobs that are challenging or tasks that are challenging, then we start to look at what can we do. So can we accommodate this in some way, right? And if it may not be possible, but hopefully it is. And then if there are tasks that are easy to do, can we increase the frequency of that? Or can we modify this job in some way so that it's more like those tasks are more frequent and more common? We want to know what accommodations are possible to reduce or eliminate the issue, which we're going to address in the next couple slides here, just give you some ideas of what that might look like. And probably most importantly is that in the accommodation process, when we're talking about cognitive limitations, you can to some degree get a doctor to help you with that, but your employee is going to be a really incredibly valuable resource for this. So they should be able to help you develop solutions, talk about what they're doing at home or in other environments that are helping you be successful or helping them be successful, and then have them give you feedback and ideas on how you can actually develop these solutions and make them a successful work accommodation for them. So getting the employee involved in the process is super important, because in some cases, their cognitive limitation is invisible, right? And in many cases, their cognitive limitation is invisible. So without their input, you may not even know what they have going on, or what could potentially be a good accommodation for them. So let's talk about some sample accommodations. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I've used reading and a couple other examples of some cognitive skills and resources that we may be able to accommodate, and just highlighted some of the ways that you could think about this. So let's start with reading first. Certainly reading information or providing it on audio tape, giving them an auditory way to hear the information rather than having to read it if they have a reading limitation can be an easy way to do that. Potentially easy, I shouldn't say that. It's not always easy, but can be a way to achieve that. Visual instructions are great, right? It's great for everyone, really. We're actually visual learners way more than we are. We learn visually way more than we do actually reading content. So visual instructions can be super important. It would be great to be able to see pictures, right? I used the example in a presentation the other day about a dishwasher, right? There is sounds like an easy task, but there are steps and an order to the process. So putting visuals up on the wall in front of the sink with a 1, and it's got the suds in there, it's actually the washing process, and then 2 is a sanitizing, and 3 is a rinse, or whatever it may be. Clearly, I'm not familiar with dishwashing practices day to day, but if you have all those details in there, right, it can be visual. There's no reason that has to be written down. It doesn't have to say 1, wash, 2, sanitize, 3, rinse. It could easily be, to make a better accommodation, it could be both, right? It could say wash and have a picture of somebody washing, and rinse and have a picture of someone rinsing, right? It can be all of the above. Right? So think about that. How can you give visual instructions? Flowcharts are a great visual for people if you have a process that you need them to understand, especially a troubleshooting process. Think about starting at the top of the flowchart. If this happens, you go to this side. If this happens, you go to that side. And then you work your way down. You can have a lot of those what if scenarios happening within your flowchart so that they understand what the process is depending on what happens at each stage of each stage. So it can be a really cool way to visually show people how to work through the process. Obviously, voice output software that reads it out loud off the computer. And you may even find that people just have a hard time tracking information. So their issue may not be that they can't read it. It's that when they look at 15 lines of text, let's say in an email, for example, and they have to read and pull out information from all of it, they can't keep it all sorted. So a line guide or something that highlights one line at a time might be a relevant accommodation for them. So these are just some examples. There will be more than this, but getting you thinking about what kinds of examples are relevant to this type of accommodation. I'm getting several requests on the side right now about getting copies of the presentation, and we totally do. For those of you who've been doing this with us for a while and come every month, then you already know this, and I apologize for repeating. For those of you who are new to joining us for a webinar, while we're doing the webinar right now, I'm recording it, and it will actually get posted on our YouTube account, and it will get shared on our homepage. So as soon as it is up online and ready for you to view, we will send out an email letting you know that it's accessible so that you can go back and watch it again if you would like to, or pull out any relevant information. It's a great way for you to revisit it. The slides themselves aren't very helpful because hopefully, I shouldn't say this for sure, but hopefully my interpretation and my information as we go along is more relevant or more helpful to you in understanding what's on the slide. So yes, there will be a presentation available. We will post it on our YouTube account, share it on our homepage, and then let you know that it's available for you. So don't worry about that. So back to our accommodations. So that was reading, talking about memory. Memory is a huge factor, right? You would be shocked at how many things in a day you pull out of your memory, right? Simple things. Even think about getting to work, right? You get up in the morning and you make yourself a coffee. Well, you remember how the coffee machine works. What button to press first, what button push second, where to put the coffee, where to put the water. All of that's memory based. It's a routine that you don't even think about it as a memory. You're not actively sitting there trying to pull it out of the air and remember all the details because it's so ingrained in your routine, you do it without even thinking. But all of that is memory based. So start to apply that to your work environment and imagine how many things are memory based, right? Think about that just for a second. How many things even in your job are memory based? Customized computer systems, right? Processes, procedures. Like all of that is all entirely memory based, right? Unless they have the ability to read or hear the instructions in another way. So that would be some ways that we can accommodate this. Try and record verbal instructions. So you don't have to remember, you can see it or hear it, right? So that's written information, verbal instructions. You can see or hear that information. Checklists are a great way, right? If you have a checklist that tells you sort of as a procedural element, and then you just have to go down the list. If you've checked every box in order, you've completed your task. Right? That's a great way. Memory no longer relevant, right? Because I'm following a list. I'm doing exactly what it's asking me to do. Prompts and reminders can be great, especially think about folks who have a lot of different, maybe different meetings even, trying to remember all the different meetings. And you can set it up so that, let's say you have something to do to prep for the meeting. You can have a reminder set for your meeting, but you can also have a task set with a reminder in your calendar that pops up with instructions. Okay, prepping for a meeting X this afternoon, you need to send out to all these people this, and this prior to the meeting, right? So it's a way of remembering without actually having to use your memory because something is going to pop up and remind you what you need to do. right? Posting instructions. Why does it have to be memorized? Can it be posted like our example of our dishwasher, right? Can those instructions be posted on the wall? Do they need to be remembered? Maybe not, right? There are lots of ways to think about how you can give instructions without having to remember it. If you think about writing accommodations as well, there are lots of ways to minimize writing. So providing templates or forms. We were actually even talking about this even further last week when I was at a human resource conference. And some employees are using tablets and things when they're out in the field, let's say, and you could use those as a way to avoid some even more writing. Instead of taking detailed notes, maybe they're using a tablet or a tool or technology in order to actually enter information. So they're hitting check boxes or they're typing information, which they may easily be able to do compared to writing. So try and think about different ways to enter information. Does it have to be paper-based? Do they have to write? In many cases in our world now, they don't. And so there are ways to get around it being written. And if it is written, the more you have fields present, right? So you actually have fields present in every such situation that somebody is populating a field rather than sort of filling out a document from scratch, right? If there's blanks and spaces and it tells them what to go in each box, it eliminates some of the memory issues and the creativity of writing. You're just answering a question and dropping it in. It can be a lot easier to do that than it is to freeform write. Right? So obviously having a scribe, you may have voice input software. So we've talked about, you've probably heard of dragon dictation software and things before, where it's actually taking in your verbal language and then turning that into written text on the computer. So that can be a great way to avoid writing as well. So I think the last one I've got in here is time management and completing tasks. So there are lots of ways that we can work on this, right? We have we talked about reminders already on your computer. You can use your reminders and strategies like that on your phone, on your computer to really be to your advantage. And then also alarms, beepers, even like if you think about a manufacturing facility, a jig assembly, right? A jig requires you to put certain pieces in a certain order, and it's designed so that it gets completed right. You see it a lot at automotive facilities, that it gets completed in exactly the right order, but it's also essentially a way of completing your task in a very structured way, right? So this needs to happen before this, and your assembly will dictate that. Sometimes you can arrange materials in orders of use. So you put whatever you use first, right? It's a very logical workflow and a good way to practice for everybody, but also perhaps a very good way for someone who has some cognitive limitations with respect to completing tasks or organization. You might need the space for a job coach. A job coach is a common accommodation that we hear about, right? People are asking for job coaches or suggesting a job coach or someone who is available to answer questions regularly can be a really great task. And that can be really fabulous unless there isn't space for them. So try and keep that in mind. Is there space for a job coach? In some workstations, there isn't. And so make sure that that's available and that the job coach is logical, like they're close, they're not, across the facility, because then they're not going to be used to their advantage. Some other ones, just sort of random ones I wanted to throw in there, is talking about what-if strategies. So what if this happens, what do we do next? What if this happens, where do we go next? Trying to present some of those strategies to them. It can be like every what if, right? It can be endless, which isn't great either, but we want to make sure that we have some of those strategies in place so that people can know what to do when they're presented with situations, especially if the what ifs are quite common, right? Sometimes they're common, sometimes they're really not. So if they are quite common, then we maybe want to address those ones in some sort of flowchart or organizational system so that the employee knows what to do in that situation. Maybe you have a detailed manual, so you have a step-by-step instructions inside a manual. So if they are presented with a situation where their memory is failing them, they don't have to go and find someone else. They have a manual there that they can get to the right page and then follow through the steps that way. Right? Maybe it's about information delivery methods. How do you deliver the information? Can you deliver it in multiple ways? Right? Some people take in information in one way, other people take it in a completely different way. So putting it into new words, explaining it in a different way. All of these can be super helpful, and information delivery can be a huge factor. So also, can we deliver it electronically versus verbally, right? All of that information ways can be ways to think about that and be more effective for a more variety of people. And then ideally, if we can, we really breaking down tasks into clear steps, right? And maybe you can define clear also as small and try doing one step at a time. So rather than giving someone 15 instructions and leaving them for the next 4 hours to complete those, right? Give them one instruction and check back in 20 minutes or half an hour. Give them another instruction, check back in another 20 minutes or half an hour, right? In some cases, it's not practical. In others, it might be. And in that case, giving them one thing to focus on at a time may help you see higher productivity from that. Okay, so I've given a return to work case study here. I'm just going to read it out, and I'll ask for your input as we go along. So what I'm going to be asking for is what are some accommodations you might recommend for this person? So I'll read the scenario, and then I'll read some sort of lingering effects he has. And then on the side there in the chat bar, if you could type in a couple of recommendations for accommodations you think might be suitable, that'd be great. And we can share those. And I've got a couple of mine as well in there that I want to add. So we'll see how we do in this situation. So the case study is that John works at a high school as a secretary, and approximately 2 months ago, there was a lockdown at his school in response to a gun on property. He was the one who initially spotted the gun, and he initiated a lockdown procedure in response to obviously seeing it. There were shots fired on premises. No one was hurt, thank goodness, but John was close enough to see and hear almost all of the situation while he was hiding under his desk with the office door locked as instructed as part of the lockdown procedure. Probably not a surprise, but in anticipation of returning to work, he's been off work for a couple months. In anticipation of returning to work, he's been incredibly anxious. He feels jumpy in situations where there are folks he does not know. And if there's anybody that resembles the individual that had the gun in particular, it's even worse. And John's desk is oriented currently so that his back is to the main door, and he has expressed concern about that and his discomfort associated with that. And twice, John has actually been out at a grocery store where it's been busy, like at a busy time. And he's had to leave because his anxiety overcame him. So one time he saw someone who he thought looked like the person who had the gun on campus or on property. And then the second time it was just too noisy and too busy, and he just couldn't handle it, and he left. So does anybody have any suggestions or ideas for potential accommodations? What would you want to make sure you do in order to help John get back to work? Perfect. The first thing that's come in here is move his desk to some place that he has more visibility, right? Reorient the desk. That's the first 3 or 4 I've seen, which is great, right? That's an easy one to potentially, depending on how the desk is organized. But even relocating him, does he have to be in that specific workstation? If there's another one with a better orientation, can we switch him to that one? Can we reorient his desk in the current situation? And and it's interesting. Someone actually suggested the idea of a second exit. Does John have a second way to escape in case of emergency? And that's kind of an interesting concept as well, right? If he has a different orientation of his existing desk or a new desk, that might be really relevant. Okay, some other good ones. Talking about less traffic locations. Is there opportunities for him to be in a less traffic spot? There may be, again, relocating or moving him. And somebody suggested exposure therapy. So access control to the school, a panic button, give him some tools so that if the situation arises, what is his steps? How is he going to manage the situation? Which I think is important, and certainly a strategy that we see a lot. And the important part, I think, with that one is the idea of the what if situations, right? What if this happens again? Here is exactly what you're supposed to do. What if it happens in the hallway? What if it happens in the office? What if it's a student? Trying to work through some of those situations and address some of the related elements in each, because some of those will be quite unique. Right? Awesome. Accompany all new introductions with someone he trusts or knows well. So anytime that he's meeting someone new, he's doing that with someone else. So if there's something coming to the office and he is uncomfortable, that he can always have a second person to help him. Ask him how he would like to set up his work area. So not just rearranging his desk, getting his input. EAP for sure, ongoing post-traumatic stress disorder. He obviously has some things going on here that he's going to need ongoing help for. So your EAP provider, certainly a medical practitioner of some kind, should be helping him with this. and look at modifying his duties so he can build up to working with someone, with people he doesn't know. So as a secretary, you're going to deal with people who walk in. There's going to be parents that you don't know. There might be other folks that come in, maybe even administrators you're not aware of. So all of that would be an element to that, that you would need to address potentially. Well, these are great ones. Okay. Security protocol at the school to restrict entry, right? That's going to make John feel, I would imagine, quite a bit more comfortable. There is now a procedure in place so that the people coming in property or actually entering the school, in theory, have passed some sort of clearance or security screening program. So not necessarily ideal, but definitely a process that could be implemented that might make John feel more comfortable, as well as anybody else that participated. Graduated return to work, for sure. The graduated return to work is different for cognitive versus physical, right? You're going to, yes, bring him back potentially slowly, but not only you may have to expose him to these things more frequently, but I think maybe as important, if not more important, is the strategies for how does he deal with these things. Yes, I'll reorient his desk. Yes, I want to bring him back slowly, reintroduce him to the environment slowly. But how do I give him a strategy? So what happens if a lockdown procedure happens? What happens if John is the one that sees someone with a knife on campus, right? What happens then? Right? And that strategy, you need him to not freeze up in that moment, right? You need him to manage that situation. So he needs to have a strategy and a very clear process about what happens so that he can hopefully function through it, right? Because it is a safety concern for everybody involved if he can't function in the situation when he needs to, right? So that becomes super important. Okay, so an interesting concept, right? What happens when John starts to identify that anxiety is coming, right? So does he have access to a quiet area, perhaps a support person, right, that can provide that support to him? Somebody suggested a photo database of staff, right? And that could extend even to like regular delivery people and other folks like that they were going to actually see on a regular basis so that when someone comes in, he should hopefully recognize who that is or be able to pull them up on documents. Check-in points are important. Yeah, absolutely. You want to make sure that you're checking in with him regularly, and that's actually one of my points on my very next slide. Create an accommodation with someone that he can go to or speak with if he recognizes he's an anxiety attack, I already mentioned. Leave his workstation if he needs to overcome periods of anxiety. And that's one of those that's really interesting, right? Sometimes the solution is that he literally walks away, right? And that needs to be okay and clearly communicated because his partners, his colleagues won't be doing that, right? They won't, if they're not having the same issues, they probably aren't going to walk away randomly throughout the day, right? But if he has those moments, we need to be able to allow him to walk away from his workstation and give him instructions about what he does when he walks away. You don't just walk away and disappear, right? You walk away and you go here. And sometimes that is literally like an HR person's office and sit down and wait for me to come back. But it might also be, that he has a quiet space, like somebody else mentioned, that he can go to. Okay. Oh, and I'm going to ask, we're going to cut it off at this point. Your suggestions, blah, blah, blah. Your suggestions are great. The last one I'm going to read out is to have mock demonstrations for staff. It's kind of like inoculation, right? If you slowly reintroduce it and have mock demonstrations and practice drills, just like you would from your just like you would for any other lockdown procedure. You just might have them more frequently or directly connected to when he returns, and they're strategically timed so that they happen when he is able to actually function through it. Okay, so at this point, I just want to open up to questions here momentarily, but I also want to put the offer out there. So in order to deal with those challenging concepts of cognitive demands assessments and accommodations, we, as I mentioned, are going to be offering one free cognitive demands assessment with the completion of a PDA. So if you have a PDA that you want completed and you are already considering moving forwards with it, now is an awesome time because we're going to dump right in there a cognitive demands assessment. So we'll do the cognitive piece for free if you are interested in doing a PDA. So make sure that you take advantage of that. Sarah is just about to send out, or if it may have already gone out, an email should be sitting in your inbox, and the first 5 companies that respond to that email and just say, I'm in, or whatever, as long as you hit reply, the first 5 companies that respond, we will connect with you to set up your PDA and then the free CDA to go with it. So please take that into account. We're really excited. We feel like this truly is the next wave, and we want to help you see how you can actually use these and make them work as part of your cognitive assessments and your mental health practices at your workplace. All right, so opening it up to questions, I have, I don't have any. Oh, I have one that Sarah's written down that I missed throughout the thing. So it says, how do you record or document the cognitive demands of a job? Do you use a standardized form? And we do, much like a PDA, much like a physical demands assessment, we do use a cognitive demands assessment form. Like I said, we do customize it a bit to fit the needs of the specific job, but we do customize it, and we will play by adding different elements, but it always has sort of a complexity level associated with it. We may document the frequency depending on whether that's relevant, and we always provide comments or information associated with that. So our cognitive demands forms are very structured because for lots of reasons, you need the person who's reading it to understand it, right? So you want to make sure that you give them a form that looks the same every time. So that ultimately is how we will set it up. Okay, and just to be respectful of everyone else, of everyone's time, it is just after 12 o'clock now. So I'm happy to stay online for another 5 minutes or so answering other questions. But if you have any additional questions, I'm happy to respond and share them out with the group as well. So I can do that after the fact. If you have to go, then that's fine, and I'll send out the questions later. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Like I said, I'll be here for a few more minutes. I hope you found the information useful and that you're as excited as we are to get working on cognitive demands in your workplace.